It was another of those electric Silverstone qualifying sessions, the crosswind, the cooler temperatures, and the relatively hard Pirelli compound tyres, the same compounds indeed that were used in circuits like Bahrain and Barcelona. The crowd going wild whenever a Lewis or a Lando or a George did a quick time. It was all there. And for a while, it looked as if, indeed, McLaren might actually do it. They finished second and third in the end. Lando Norris just ahead of the brilliant Oscar Piastri. I say brilliant because this is his rookie season, don't forget. This is an amazing performance from the young Australian. Anyway, we'll get onto that in a minute. The pole eventually did go to Max Verstappen, but he had to be very circumspect. There were a few issues as well. He understeered in the pit lane into the wall. The biggest shunt he's had all year, it was in the pit lane at Silverstone, damaging the front wing. No problem, of course. They changed it without any problem in the Red Bull garage. But the track was semi-wet. There was a bit of a decision at the beginning of Q1 with regard to intermediates or slicks. It was slicks, but there were interruptions when cars stopped on the track. The weather kept changing. The rain squalls arrived, then they went away. And finally in Q3, they were able to apply DRS, and it was slicks and it was Max Verstappen that just got in the pole. It was very, very close. And much of what we saw today was dictated by the colder temperatures in concert with the harder Pirelli compound and, of course, the new Pirelli construction. For sure, McLaren were getting absolutely into the sweet spot with their tyres, and some of the other teams, notably Aston Martin, were not doing anything like the same thing. So what a switch, just given the climatic conditions, the variables, as we often talk about. But through it all, Red Bull just consistently keeping their head down and doing the job with, got to say, with Max Verstappen, because Sergio Perez did not even make it out of Q1. I think that says a little bit about the job that Max did today. It wasn't a super large sweet spot for Red Bull either, and we've seen that before. When the temperatures are cold, the track and the ambient temperatures are colder than perhaps predicted, it's always been Red Bull's problem just getting temperature in the tyres. Max did all that and he got the pole, just as he did in Barcelona. But for Sergio Perez, it was a really big problem. Didn't get out of Q1. And I think the same can probably be said about the Ferrari as well. If the ambients had been higher, probably the Ferrari would have had more grip relative to its newly found top speed. Before we get down to all the details and the numbers and the data, let's have a look at some of the nuances of qualifying first. There was the Max Verstappen incident with the nose. There was Oscar Piastri putting massive pressure on Lando Norris. There was a moment in Q2 when Lando brought the crowd to their feet by going purple P1, and then very shortly after, Oscar gazumped him. And that, I mean, I've said several times on this channel, on these videos, that for me, putting pressure on Lando is not the way to get the best from him, and he'd probably be more comfortable with the Daniel Ricciardo in the other car. So it all came down to Q3 in terms of that McLaren battle. And I got to say, Lando just superb, absolutely brilliant, how he put in a lap right at the end to go slightly quicker than Oscar to get P2 rather than P3. That was a seminal moment, I think, in the career for Lando Norris, because had Oscar out-qualified him at Silverstone, that's not something he would have swallowed particularly easily and may well have stayed with him for the rest of the season. So very, very good performance from Lando Norris. And there was a bit of a skirmish inside Ferrari today. Charles Leclerc recovered well from not having run in FP2 yesterday. He was quick in FP3. We'll get onto that towards the end of this video and looked very good. But there was a weird moment when they're all stacking up at the end of Q2 to get out there just when everyone was out for one lap right at the end because there was a delay. And there was a horrendous traffic jam going into club. As you can imagine, everybody's slowing down to try to get a clear run for their quick lap. And presumably Ferrari had some sort of team orders issued at some point, saying in that situation, just stay in line, don't pass one another, because there's going to be enough chaotic traffic anyway. So we're on board Charles, who's doing 3 miles an hour in the traffic. And then Carlos comes around the outside of him and gets a position going into club, the right-hander. And Charles gets on the radio and says, "Oh, nice one, good overtake, Carlos." Obviously very sarcastic. And later on, Carlos got on the radio to say, "Look, I didn't think that was particularly fair. I didn't want to lose tyre temperature. I was behind, admittedly only one place. There were P3, P4 at that point. I was behind Charles, and I had more to lose if I didn't keep the temperatures up." So what do I think of that? I think, first of all, it's sort of over the top, I think, to be sort of spoon-feeding Charles like that and applying team orders for team orders, not really, instructions going into Q2 in terms of they're on a very slow lap, so don't pass one another. I think they're both over 21 and they both know how to handle that situation. And I think that gives us a bit of an insight on how at the moment they're sort of treating Charles with kid gloves and trying to do everything they can to make him feel super confident in the team under the heading of strategy and politics. And I think it was over the top myself. And I kind of sympathise with Carlos Sainz, actually, to be honest, because the one thing you've got to think about is tyre temperature, which is an insight as well into how important temperatures were in qualifying. And so I think it's a bit of a mess, really. If I was in, you've always got to put yourself in the position of the team principal or the team manager when you make comments like this. And if I tried to put myself in that position, I would have left it to them, and I wouldn't have allowed it to become political as it did. Then there was Sergio Perez not getting out of Q1. I mean, it's almost to the point, well, yeah, so what's new? It really, really was a sad thing to see. He was on the bubble going into the last sprint in Q1. There was a delay. And he went from P14 to P17, whereas Alex Albon, who was P20, having had a lap time deleted, in one lap went from P20 to P5 or 6. So it was doable for a racer, and I made a comment in the live stream just a couple of days ago that I think Red Bull might well be looking at getting Alex Albon back into their fold again. And I know there's been some interest from Red Bull's Thai part owner in that score as well. Really good performance from Alex Albon as well. And both Williams got into Q2. Another incredible performance for them as well. Logan Sargent too. Excellent. I'm going off at tangents, but I've got to say Williams did a really, really good job again in qualifying under pressure in front of their home crowd. And the livery on the car I thought looked superb as well. Sort of white Union Jack. Frank would have loved it. He would have loved the blue and white because that's what it was originally. And he would have loved that rendition of the Union Jack on the back of the car. Union flag, I think we're supposed to call it these days, aren't we? And then at that restart as well, there was a bit of a weird thing going on with Lewis and Max Verstappen, where Lewis the clock was ticking. There wasn't a lot of time to get out there and get temperature into the tyres and get you one lap in. And Lewis was ahead of Max in the pit lane queue and accelerated out normally. And you could tell that Max behind him was, come on, Lewis, want to go a bit quicker than this, and was sort of all over him coming out of the tight left-hander before the first long straight under the bridge. And you could see that he pulled out halfway just sort of get past. And at this point, Lewis started weaving to warm up the tyres. And I was thinking, they're not going slowly there. And I wonder if Lewis actually knows that Max is right there. And I'm only saying that because I don't think we ever talk about that very much, do we? This amount of weaving that goes on when they're out there on the track with other cars around them, potentially going quickly in that situation. It was a bit dodgy, and it was a bit worrying. And Lewis is doing nothing intentionally, of course, but had he known that Max was there, I'm sure he wouldn't have been weaving as much as he was. And Max had to do one of these just to avoid one of Lewis's weaves. So I thought that was a little bit odd and was kind of reminiscent, I suppose, a little bit of the 2021 season, although of course the difference between the Merc and the Red Bull now, it's just like night and day, two different categories of racing almost. The other final point in terms of nuances I would say was that it was so impressive to see how Max and Red Bull left themselves with two new sets of soft tyres for Q3. No, as far as I could see, no other runner did that, and that's part of their organisation, and we didn't see Max running soft tyres when everybody else was out on Friday and Saturday on the soft. He was sticking to the medium and doing his long runs, doing his homework, and that's where obviously it pays off in the race in terms of knowing how the tyres are going to react and how hard he can push the car with a fuel load. But it also pays off, as we know, in qualifying when he's left with two new sets and everybody else is having to run a used set when they don't really want to do it. And that, again, it's just one of the tiny details of when you're on top and when things are going well and you've got a very good car. These are the tiny details that really matter. So all in all, it was a fascinating qualifying session. And the most interesting part was that DRS was enabled for Q3. In other words, it was disabled for Q1 and Q2 when the track was just drying. But Q3, it was considered to be a dry track, even though it was damp offline and the curbs were a little bit dodgy. But DRS was enabled, so we were able to make a direct comparison between top speeds with DRS disabled and DRS enabled. So let's have a look at how the teams benefited from running DRS in Q3. Obviously, it only applied to the top 10 runners, so I've just taken a sample of the key cars. You can see Red Bull with Max benefit to the tune of 24 kilometers an hour. I should point out these differences are the top speed at the end of intermediate 1, which is under the Heineken Bridge before they get to the complex. And there today, there was a bit of a tailwind. The speed there was about the same as the speed trap on Hangar Straight down to Stowe, where there was a headwind. So it was kind of relevant, I guess. But there you can see Max Verstappen gained 24 kilometers an hour with DRS enabled, flattening the wing. McLaren, not bad, 20 kilometers an hour. It's still 4 kilometers short of Red Bull, but quite impressive that they have got it to that. Ferrari, and we heard from Shub yesterday saying that potentially Ferrari have found the way to do that as well. 19, the same as Aston Martin. So if Ferrari have found some sort of trick, Red Bull-like trick, maybe it was disguised by not being able to get the temperatures right on the tyres on this cooler day at Silverstone. But it shouldn't affect them in terms of top speed there, because even if they got a traction problem, they should have overcome it by the time they get to the bridge, having said all that. And then you can see Mercedes. This is one of Mercedes' problems, quite obviously. Only 14 kilometers an hour improvement for Lewis Hamilton with between running DRS and no DRS. So if they want an answer, I mean, Lewis kept saying, this morning, a half second off the pace, where's the time? And the engineers would get on the radio and say, well, it's, looks like top speed, Lewis. Well, it's also that. It's 14 kilometers an hour compared with Red Bull's 24 kilometers an hour. And before we get too carried away in terms of what the actual top speeds are, let's have a look at the speed trap. Again, I've only put in the runners who made it through to Q3. Fernando Alonso, quickest in the Aston Martin. And that, to me, is not only a surprise, but it's a shock, because what are Aston doing being that quick? To me, that means they're not generating anything like as much downforce as they would like around Silverstone. Probably a function of temperatures, tyre temperatures, and trying to get the car set up around that and taking off downforce, taking out downforce. I would hope it's that, or maybe they're running as much downforce as they want and it's not giving them any grip, in which case they've got a real problem. But Fernando Alonso, astonishingly quickest through the trap, 3.27. Then the Ferraris and Max Verstappen all the same time. So that is where we're seeing that drag reduction on the new beam wing at Ferrari that Shub was talking about coming into effect. Very, very low drag on the back of the Ferrari now, so 326, very much of a muchness there between the two Ferraris. And then George Russell showing with Lewis Hamilton that the Mercedes actually wasn't that slow in a straight line. Nothing like as slow, dare I say it, as the McLarens. So that will be a real conundrum for Mercedes, because they can't really say, oh, well, we're just losing out because we're slow in a straight line, we're really quick around the corners, because there's McLaren doing what Mercedes normally talk about. We're really good around corners. And indeed, Aston Martin often talk about. McLaren are the team that got the grip today. And McLaren didn't have great top speed, but look how quick they were with the overall lap time. So really, really impressive performance. I'm not sure, looking at those numbers, that McLaren would have gone into qualifying today saying, right, we're going to take off top speed, we're going to add grip to the car, it's going to be the answer around Silverstone. I think everybody was sort of juggling balls and sniffing the air and doing the best job in terms of engineering, a best job for the setup of the car. And on this occasion, with the ambience like this and tyre temperatures like this, it was McLaren that got the sweet spot. And despite not being quick in a straight line, unbelievably good around corners, you've got to say. And that in turn was borne out by the trap speeds for the end of Sector 2, which is 50 metres, only 50 metres after the exit of Beckett's. And guess who was quickest there? Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri second, 271, 270, virtually the same. And I think that just shows how good McLaren were through Beckett's. And then they would have just hit sort of terminal velocity pretty quickly, and a couple of teams would have gone past them. But by then, the damage was done. Max Verstappen, 270, Fernando Alonso, 269. A lot of that Fernando probably more than Aston Martin, I suspect. Lewis 269. Ferrari relatively slow through there, and so that just shows where McLaren's real pace came from. That particularly through Beckett's, which is a great place to be quick at Silverstone. Another little tweak we saw in FP3 this morning when it rained halfway through the session. And you thought, oh, well, it's kind of the end of it, I guess. And Charles Leclerc was out on slicks, as everybody was when the rain started to fall. Everybody rushed in, and Charles said, no, I'm going to stay out on slicks. I won't take any risks, I promise. But it was good to see, because there he was doing some homework, working on his own driving on slicks. He had a spin coming out of the complex, 360, kept going, working on his driving in very, very slippery conditions on slicks. He only did one lap, took a long time, but it was good to see a driver just doing that and just practicing his driving as distinct from all the other stuff they're always doing, which is basically what the engineers want them to run on the car. So I thought that was a nice little thing. And then everybody, a lot of runners went out in the wet, and so let's have a look who was quickest in the wet. What a surprise, Max Verstappen, 38.5, massively quicker than anybody else in the wet. So if it is wet tomorrow in the race, Max will not be shy, I don't think, from where he's starting the race. George Russell, hope for Mercedes yet. George Russell was P2, 40.0 in the wet. Now again, not everybody ran, and the track conditions were changing a lot. There was wind, the standing water was moving around, there was traffic, the usual thing. So you shouldn't read too much into it. But George wouldn't be doing that lap unless the car was half drivable, I wouldn't have thought. And you'd expect the Mercedes to be drivable, because it doesn't have a massive amount of downforce. It's not going to be massively twitchy. It's just going to be a nice drivable race car, probably, with a reasonable balance. Charles Leclerc 40.4, which would have given him some confidence to be as quick as his teammate Carlos Sainz in the wet. So that was a Charles thing. Fernando was quickest for a while, wasn't out when the track was super quick, but he looked really, really good in the wet as ever. And then look, both McLarens there as well, 41.3 Lando, 41.7 Oscar. Both drivers out there in the wet, and both going well, both competitive. Sergio Perez sort of, there or thereabouts, not really setting the world on fire. So yeah, nice little cameo wet session. Big bit of a mention there for Nick de Vries too. I thought he did quite a good job in the wet, looked pretty good, and didn't work out for him in qualifying at all. So just to finish, quickly go through the grid. Kevin Magnussen stopped out on the circuit. He was one of the reasons they brought out the red flag for a while, so he didn't make it through to Q2. Nick de Vries did not either. Guan Yu Zhou was another. Yuki Tsunoda, a bit of a surprise, he didn't get through in the AlphaTauri. And Sergio Perez, as I mentioned, didn't get through to Q2 either. Seems unbelievable to be saying that again, but anyway, that was the situation. Valtteri Bottas did a good job, but then he stopped in Q2, so he'll be starting 15th. Logan Sargent, excellent job, I thought, in the second Williams. Esteban Ocon, a bit of a contretemps with Lance Stroll at the back end of Q2. Basically, Esteban just ran wide coming into the complex. Stroll didn't make it either, therefore P12. And Nico Hülkenberg did a good job in Q1, but didn't get through finally to Q3. And Pierre Gasly will be starting 10th in the Alpine. Did a pretty good job. I mean, 27.6 to Lewis Hamilton 27.2 for Alpine, who, I mean, anybody can complain about potentially not being great in top speed. It's always going to be the Renault drivers. So around Silverstone, not a bad performance at all from Alpine and from Pierre Gasly. Fernando Alonso, disappointing, but as I say, for me, this was a tyre temperature thing, which rewarded McLaren and I think has hurt Aston Martin here, 27.6 for Fernando. In the end, the two Mercedes drivers settled down with George Russell just ahead of Lewis Hamilton, 27.1, 27.2. Charles Leclerc did almost the same time as Carlos Sainz, just fractionally quicker than Carlos Sainz. Similarly with Lando and Oscar Piastri at McLaren, very, very close. And finally, Max Verstappen out there on his own. What a job. I think a lot of people will be, I mean, look, Lando said twice, Max always ruins it for everybody. And I think we're getting to the point now in Formula One where everyone was saying, it's so boring to have Max always on the pole. But, yeah, everyone's going to say that. All that white noise will be out there. But I think the real enthusiasts should not in any way allow that to detract from the job that Max is doing. And I said, just one example was that business of having two sets of soft tyres available for Q3 when it really mattered, and putting in the lap time when it mattered as well. You can say under pressure from McLaren on a day when Red Bull didn't get the car absolutely perfect. So yeah, hats off to him, chapeau to Max and Red Bull, but also to McLaren. What a great job they did. great to see the enthusiasm that McLaren are engendering in Formula One. They're both young guys. Zach Brown's a sort of relatively young, new generation team principal with lots of new creative ideas as well. So that's a whole new thing, isn't it? Beginning of a whole new era, probably, in Formula One. Anyway, there we are. Big thanks to Jetcraft and to Pitbox.io, who are great supporters of this channel. Congratulations to Frederick Vesti, winner of the F2 sprint race today in the wet. Really, really good drive. He's a Mercedes contracted driver, as you probably know. And I'll be back again tomorrow with a video after the British Grand Prix. Let's see what happens then. Take care.